Hello everybody and welcome to Toitu to You Curator's Corner episode number 22. My name's Sean Brosnan. I'm a curator at Toitu Otago Settlers Museum here in Dunedin. I began making these little stories about early Dunedin history during the coronavirus lockdown, and now I'm just keeping them going. Today's story is going to be about Dunedin's first judge, Sydney Stephen. His appointment in July 1850 was something of an affront to the pioneer settlers of Otago. Firstly, because there was no need for it. Dunedin was almost completely crime-free, at least as far as serious offences went. And secondly, and perhaps more painfully to an overwhelmingly Scottish population, because of the vast expense that it entailed. The judge's salary alone, for instance, was £800, which was more than a quarter of all the government revenue that came in from Otago. So it was a walloping great sum for an absolutely pointless office. Dr. Hocken describes it in his history as a droll but expensive absurdity, and I think he's right on that. This cartoon by James Brown is the only pictorial representation of the judge that we have. Now, the Dunedin Supreme Court opened for the first time on the 18th of June 1851, but since there were no cases to be heard, civil or criminal, it was immediately adjourned. Judge Stephen nonetheless held a slap-up public dinner to mark the occasion, and he also had a special judge's chair made. Here it is now on display at Toitu in our New Edinburgh section. Now, subsequently, there were just a few more sittings of the Supreme Court, all equally pointless with no cases to try, but on every occasion, Judge Stephen insisted on the full panoply of the law being on display. Each time, for example, 36 men were summoned to serve as potential jurors on any cases that might be required. And many of them had to travel in from the country at great personal inconvenience and with real difficulty over the trackless wastes of countryside. But woe betide any jury members who failed to show up when they were summoned. Judge Stephen ruthlessly enforced some quite hefty fines for non-attendance. But that's not really the interesting bit. Our story today relates rather to Judge Stephen himself and the considerable mischief that he caused while waiting round for something serious enough criminally to require his judicial attention to happen. Because although he was generally described as a rather jolly sort of fellow, he also seems to be one of those sort of people who, no matter where he was, always caused some sort of ruckus. So what happened during his brief sojourn in Dunedin? Well, as ever, it's quite hard to read between the lines of the old newspaper reports, but Stephen seems to have had some sort of involvement with a young woman, Miss Mary Jane Graham, as a result of which she was abandoned by her family, so it probably involved some sort of disgrace. And she then began to make allegations against the judge, which he was very keen to shut down. Was it something sexual? Perhaps. We just can't tell from this distance. But whatever it was, it saw the judge storm into the offices of Ed McGlashan and threaten the Port Chalmers storekeeper, William Mansford, who had taken on something of a role as Miss Graham's protector, and was there to help her with her legal case, and threatened him with assault, shaking his fist in Mansford's face and promising to break every bone in his body if he continued to spread stories about the judge. Mansford promptly charged Judge Stephen with assault, but the judge immediately countered with his own charge of libel against Mr. Mansford and Miss Graham. And the two cases were set down to be heard by the whole assembled group of Dunedin magistrates before a packed Courthouse in Dunedin in January of 1852. It was surely going to be the best show in town, and boy, did it deliver on that. For a start, Judge Stephen's own lawyer, David Garrick, although he was on the bench of magistrates himself and therefore adjudicated on the case, he didn't let that stop him from descending into the witness box and testifying on Judge Stephen's behalf, and then immediately went back up onto the bench to assume the role of judge in the case. Quite bizarre, really. Then, in presenting his excuses for why he had threatened William Mansford with assault, Judge Stephen made the extraordinary statement that in the circumstances, he could hardly be expected to wait for what he called the slow and tardy administration of the law. Well, the magistrates duly found in the judge's favour in both cases, dismissing the assault charge and committing Mansford and Miss Graham to trial at the next sitting of the Dunedin Supreme Court. And who would be the judge in that case? presumably Stephen himself. No wonder the assembled townsfolk, packed into the courthouse, greeted the proceedings with boos and hisses, and promptly donated all of the money that Mansfield and Miss Graham were required to pay as bail bonds. And that's also where our old friend Dr. Manning, the subject of the last two episodes, comes into the picture, because as the judge was leaving the court, triumphant in his victory, I presume, Dr. Manning confronted him and challenged him to a duel for impugning the good name of the young lady. How gallant, how old-fashioned, how Dr. Henry Manning. No duel occurred, of course, the judge immediately having recourse to the law and having the doctor bound over to preserve the peace. Now, unsurprisingly, after all this debacle, Judge Stephen was swiftly moved to a new post in Wellington soon after. I suspect it was a case of moving him sideways to avoid further scandal, but he would subsequently rise further, being promoted to become, in fact, the Chief Justice of New Zealand, based in Auckland later on, where he died in 1858. Stephen had really made a pig's ear of establishing the higher levels of justice in Dunedin, and soon after he left, Otago's first Supreme Court was quietly abolished. And it was not missed by the good and unbelievably law-abiding citizens of pioneer Dunedin. So I hope you enjoyed that little story about the bizarre beginnings of high justice in Dunedin, and if you did, you might like to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to be notified of future episodes.